You are listening to Inside IASB, a podcast series dedicated to informing and encouraging Illinois School Board members. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Isaac Warren. I am the Director of Digital Communications at the Illinois Association of School Boards. And with me today to talk about Foundational Principle number 3, I have Dr. Perry Hill IV, who is a Director of Outreach and Training here at the Association. We're going to be talking about how and why the school board employs a superintendent. So, Perry, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. Well, let's just dive on in and get right into the nitty-gritty of it. Why do we as an association emphasize that the board employs and evaluates one person, the superintendent, and how does that focus influence district governance?
The key word which addresses why IASB emphasizes that the board employs and evaluates one person, which is the superintendent, that key word is employ. Now, the term employ reminds the board that it should only directly engage in the act of human resources for one individual, and that's the superintendent. This means that the board only reviews the resumes for one position, only conducts interviews for one position, only interacts with those who are considered for one position, and they only evaluate for one position. And this is a multifaceted position that has a variety of roles, and that's the position of the district superintendent. Addressing why the board only is only charged with employing and evaluating one person arises from one of the multifaceted roles that the superintendent fulfills. The superintendent is the board's exclusive intermediary, and that is the one person who is charged with serving as the go-between or the connector between the board and staff, students, as well as the community. Now, the board's sole employment, the board's sole reliance upon the superintendent stems from the steadfast trust and ongoing communication that must prevail between them. After all, trust and direct communication with one is more straightforward and verifiable than with many other individuals. So in the end, it is the exclusive intermediary, the superintendent, who aids the board in maintaining its objectivity. It's the exclusive intermediary who brings specialized educational leadership expertise to advise the board. It is this exclusive intermediary who has been imparted with the board's delegated authority to manage staff, operations, and enactment of the board's vision for the district. And I must say, it is the exclusive intermediary with whom the board evaluates through a philosophy called focused accountability, which means that the board has specific actions it expects the superintendent to achieve. Now, I do want to go back to that term employ. Employ implies initiating a formal, long-term relationship with an exclusive educational specialist who is empowered to select and manage all other staff. Now, there is a restatement I want to offer. Earlier, I mentioned about the word employ, but I want to draw a distinction between the word employ and the word hire as it relates to foundational principle number 3, I must say. When we look at these two words, employ and hire, as it relates to foundational principle number 3, the task of the board employing is a direct act. As I said earlier, the board is directly involved with face-to-face interviews, directly involved with the sorting of resumes, the selecting of resumes, etc. It's done for only one individual, that superintendent. Now, the contrast to employ is hire or hiring. The act of hiring, which the board does also, is an indirect act, which is done by an intermediary. This means that when the board hires all other staff, excluding the superintendent, it is voting based on the unofficial hiring decision and recommendation of its intermediary, the superintendent. So that's a big difference between the two. So the board employs one individual. That's its intermediary, the superintendent, but it hires all other staff members.
That's excellent. And I really do. That's a very great overview of it. And again, this it's almost deceptive at how simple it is. It's very like, just hire employee superintendent. Like I said, the difference between hiring and employing is there's a distinct difference. And you're hiring essentially however many facets this person's in charge of. And I mean, I almost feel like it doesn't, the weight of foundational principle 3 isn't quite there because it's like, you can't get it across in that short sense, like how important this is and how many roles you really are hiring for this. It's huge.
Absolutely. And the superintendent is a customized position that reflects the unique needs of the school district.
Yeah. And I can understand why it'd be kind of hard to find because you have a district that has specific needs. You need a bespoke person for this bespoke role, and that can be kind of hard. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
And compatibility is very important.
Very, yeah. And speaking of compatibility, what would you say a healthy, productive relationship between the school board and the superintendent looks like in day-to-day practice?
In day-to-day practice, a healthy, productive relationship between the school board and the superintendent involves, I'd say, number one, an awareness and application of all of the foundational principles of effective governance. Next, I would say that it entails the board recognizing that its oversight, its decision-making, its governance duties must be conducted from a high-level perspective that theorists known as Heifetz, Broholm, and Johnson labeled as the balcony. In contrast, leadership of day-to-day district operation activities must be conducted by the staff under the direction of the superintendent. Now, Heifetz, Broholm, and Johnson label day-to-day district operation activities as the dance floor. Now, the health and productivity from the board-superintendent relationship really emerges from board members observing and or listening to matters occurring on the dance floor and refraining from direct involvement in the dance floor activities. That's the big test. Now, instead of a board member seeing or hearing something in question on the dance floor, rather the board member should communicate with the superintendent about the items that he or she observed or heard and seek clarity from the superintendent on that particular matter. That means the superintendent, upon hearing of the concern, they will engage in a form of an investigation in order to collect information and then present that information to the board member and the board. Now, sharing information with the superintendent empowers that person to do the job of fulfilling the management role in which they were employed to fill. So that's another aspect that really helps that productive, healthy relationship between the school board and the superintendent. But there's more. Another key point which helps a productive, healthy relationship is the board recognizing what its duties are and the superintendent recognizing what his or her duties are. The board's duties involve governing, speaking with one voice, identifying intended results. That's the board's duty. The superintendent's duty involves managing, leading the staff to improve district performance, providing recommendations to the board, implementing board action, and ensuring compliance to policies. So it's important that both entities of the governance team understand their roles in order to have that productive relationship. And lastly, it's important that the board focuses on the ends of the districts, while the superintendent should be focusing on the means which enables the ends to become a reality in the district. If you have both entities of the governance team, the board and the superintendent fulfilling their role, their part, whether it's the dance floor versus the balcony, whether it's the foundational principles, whether it's their roles and responsibilities, then you will have the blossoming and the sustaining of a productive, healthy relationship among the entities of the governance team.
Yeah, and I think a really key thing I noticed in your answer was there's a consistent theme of constant communication back and forth, because if you're not communicating with each other, I mean, how can anything get done? But also, it helps because we're talking about some mutual respect of like the board is referring to the expertise of the superintendent for their expertise, and vice versa. The superintendent's asking the board, like, what is the community saying? And things like that. So it kind of leads us into our next question about mutual respect and role clarity, which again, they're essential to this principle. So how can boards and superintendents establish clear expectations and boundaries from the outset?
I'm going to repeat a word that you already said a number of times: communication. When we talk about how Boards and superintendents can establish clear expectations and boundaries from the outset. It involves communication with the board collective. So that's all 7 board members. So that means that ideally, the board and the superintendent should sit down and have a conversation. They should do some troubleshooting, explore different scenarios or conditions that may come up or have come up, revisit the past handling of situations, and identify what's the preferred, expected means of addressing those items so that number one, the superintendent can know the expectations of the full board, not just 1 or 2 members, but the full board, and be able to deliver. That's just being fair, and that's being open by providing every board member an opportunity to voice their perspective and then reaching consensus on what the final act or expectation is going to be. I also will say that when it comes to establishing clear expectations and boundaries, we're talking about the creation of what is formally called board protocols or board norms. These are set procedures or means of operating in which the board consistently will follow and expect each member to follow. So that there are no surprises. And so board members are educated in advance on what steps they need to take in order to address certain issues. It also provides some insight for board members to know what they can expect the superintendent to do if certain issues should arise. They can expect, for example, to get a bi-weekly update. They can expect to have an opportunity for the superintendent to provide a window of time for questions to be asked leading up to each board member regarding the agenda. It just feeds into an awareness for all parties.
Gotcha. And I think I'm glad you brought the expectations and boundaries. And I'm thinking about the perspective of, let's say you have a tenured superintendent who comes from a previous board and are already used to a certain way that board operates and that board does their work. Then they come to a new board, and now they kind of have to relearn how that board operates. And then the board has to maybe be willing to accept that the superintendent might have some ideas like, hey, this worked for my other board. Maybe it might work for our board.
Absolutely. And it really highlights one of my comments to the first question you posed, because the superintendent is an educational specialist who is the advisor to the board. So the advisement role doesn't just involve recommending a course of action. It involves sharing expertise about how the board can consider options to navigate around challenges.
Sure, yeah. And so we talked about just like the importance of this role and everything kind of going into it. Can we talk a bit more about maybe some of the contract work? I mean, what are the key components of a thoughtfully crafted superintendent contract and job description? And why do these documents matter so much for long-term success?
Well, some items that really comprise, I'll use your words, a thoughtfully crafted superintendent contract and job description, really find their origins in some of the essentials of a school district. Number one, it's very important that in a superintendent contract and job description, you are complying with all the statutory requirements and terminology that is expected by the powers that be in Springfield as well as Washington, D.C. It's also important that in these items, the contract, the job description, that you have the appropriate items from policy spelled out. Particularly when you're talking about the superintendent's contract and job description, a great example would be you want to make sure that you're pulling key items from Section 3 of the policy manual, which deals with the superintendent's roles and responsibilities and duties and also contractual components. You also want to make sure that in a thoughtfully crafted contract and job description that you being the board has taken the time to identify what are our district's needs. I mentioned earlier that the superintendency is really a customized position that reflects the needs of that district, so the board should know what those prioritized needs are. Another area that should be infused in the contract or the job description would be components of the officially adopted district goals that were clarified and crafted by the Board of Education. You also can take some elements from a strategic plan that's still in motion, still being enacted, and you can infuse some of those elements within the contract and job description also. The key is when we're talking about the contract, when we're talking about the job description, it's very important that a board utilize its legal counsel. When we talk about the contract, of course, the superintendent will have their legal counsel, and then the board should have their separate legal counsel reflecting the board's position. So those are some areas, some documents also, which can bring about long-term success for both parties.
Right, because the ultimate goal is you want the superintendent to stick around for quite a while, ideally, and being sure that you know upfront what your district goals are and what you want to achieve. Lets the superintendent know what they're expected, like we've been talking about, what to do, so they're not caught off guard in the middle of their tenure. Like, hey, I didn't expect this. I maybe not quite wouldn't have been the right person for this if I had known ahead of time.
That's true, because those documents, the contract and the job description, really reflect the ends. We go back to that term again, the ends that the board desires to see accomplished within the district.
Right. Yeah. Again, communication has been our kind of ongoing recurring theme here. And we emphasize those protocols of communication a lot. What kinds of communication structures or routines would help the board and superintendent stay aligned without micromanaging, kind of staying in their respective lanes?
I would say some kinds of communication structures or routines that might help the board and superintendent stay aligned without micromanaging goes back to communication. When we talk about protocols are really emphasized to promote communication, consistency, and cooperation among the board as well as the governance team. The protocols are going to provide direct communication, immediate communication, accurate communication, consistent communication, proactive and reactive communication, and they also promote hierarchical communication. Because the reality is that the board and the superintendent should understand what communication is going to be done by the board president per policy, because the board president speaks for the board, and what communication will be done by the superintendent, because the superintendent is the spokesperson for the district. So making sure there's an understanding of those structures really will go a long way in making sure that micromanagement is avoided. There's clarity.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. We've been talking about the board delegating authority to the superintendent to select and evaluate staff. So through the superintendent's position, of course. So why is this delegation important, and what happens when a board does overstep into administrative work? What happens when they do start that micromanaging?
Well, first and foremost, delegation is extremely vital for a school board and for a district, because the reality is a board cannot, nor should it want to, do everything within a district. That's why the board employs an educational specialist who in turn uses that same delegation model and the delegated authority of the board to hire other educational specialists in more specific fields to advance the board's vision for the district. When it comes to the superintendent has more direct knowledge of staff performance and how well the staff will help deliver the board's district goals. So it's very important that the board embrace the act of delegation, because the reality is that when the board hires other staff members to perform tasks, that at the end of the day, they're relying upon their employee, the superintendent, to affirm whether they are delivering at a rate of success that's timely for the board and district's purposes.
And so how can a board then fairly and effectively evaluate a superintendent's performance, especially when the district's work is complex and outcomes often take time?
Well, when we talk about how a school board fairly and effectively evaluates the superintendent's performance, it does so through work with the superintendent. The superintendent evaluation process, which includes the instrument, is not developed nor enacted in isolation. The board and the superintendent come together and they come to mutual agreement on every component of the superintendent evaluation process. They have to mutually agree on the process. They have to mutually agree on the instrument. They have to make sure that all components, applicable components of the law, are followed. They have to make sure that all applicable components of the policy is followed. They have to make sure that there is some form of incorporation of the formally adopted district goals and the mutually agreed contractual goals that appear within the instrument itself. And of course, when we're talking about the evaluation process, there should be mutual agreement on the timeliness of that process, on what the board's expectations are of the superintendent when it comes to rendering reports or updates on each goal prior to the summative evaluation. And it's important that there is an understanding of the superintendent completing a self-evaluation prior to the board completing their summative evaluation instrument. So those are most of the components that are integral in order for there to be an effective superintendent evaluation process. As far as the performance of the superintendent is concerned, it goes right back to those updates. A board should not be waiting until they get to the new year, so that means January, February, March, to, for a first time, hear about the rate of progress on those contractual and those district goals. If the board gets those constant updates along the way, they can make tweaks along the way, because the reality is unforeseen situations happen. So a board and a superintendent can come together and come to, again, mutual agreement on what those tweaks will look like. Because the bottom line is the board wants to be fair to the superintendent, and they also want to be fair to the board.
Right. And I, like you said, I really like the making small tweaks along the way. I mean, that's got to be a lot easier and better to digest than making one huge sweeping change if they do it once a year.
Oh, most definitely.
I mean, it's just better health for the board. It's better for the community because they can see some changes are happening. And they're probably going to be more receptive to, like, hey, we're make a small tweak to our plan because things happen, you know?
Well, and actually, I'd like to zero in on what you just said about the tweaks and the updates. When the updates happen, where you have a superintendent providing a formal report or delegating some other central office administrator to make a report, or school level for that matter, it benefits the board because they're hearing the information. It benefits the superintendent because it's providing a means for them to share and communicate what's happening relative to that goal or those goals. But it also benefits the public because those reports, those updates are going to be presented in an open session meeting. So the community really gets to hear how their district is advancing and understand that the board is taking the time to evaluate and hold accountable the superintendent as the chief executive officer of the district.
And I think it also shows, like, it doesn't really matter how complex or non-complex some work in your district is. You should be having these very regular, very routine updates with your superintendent. And the complexity of a project really is no excuse. If the superintendent doesn't have clarity on a project, that's a sign that they need to get on board with some new information. Or if the board doesn't have it's like, oh, it's too complex for the board. Well, they need to get some more information so they're on the same page too. With all this being said, I'd like to end on this question. If you could just share an example of a district where some strong board superintendent alignment led to measurable improvements and what made that relationship effective.
Well, I can't provide a specific district, although there are many, but I will say that the many strong board superintendent alignments that have led to measurable improvements among the many boards I've worked with really have resulted from the board knowing its role, the superintendent knowing their role. And I'm really going to take a step back and highlight foundational principle number 1. I know I'm addressing number 3, but they're all interrelated. But foundational principle number 1 talks about the board is responsible for clarifying the district purpose. My experience has been that strong board superintendent alignment that leads to measurable improvements derives from, number 1, the board accepting its domain of goal setting. So it's the responsibility of the board to craft and to develop those district goals that they believe will help the district meet its immediate prioritized needs. Now, along the same lines of foundational principle number 1 is not just goal setting, because when you clarify the district purpose, once the board fulfills its domain of goal setting, the other part of that district purpose is the superintendent fulfilling his or her responsibilities in the domain of strategic planning. If the board never takes the time to develop its district goals, they can never and should never expect a superintendent to present to them a strategic plan, because the superintendent does not have those essential ingredients in which to make a plan. The plan is based upon the formally adopted goals developed by the board. So those measurable improvements for a district can only come when a board and a superintendent embrace those two complementary roles which are linked to foundational principle number 1. And I must say, another perk of making sure the board does its goal-setting duties and the superintendent follows through with taking the goals and making the strategic plan is that a district, a board that has a set of district goals and they have a strategic plan is a district that really can minimize personal agendas from rising up with individual board members. Because the code of conduct, which is in the district policy of every Illinois public school district, in Section 2, policy number 80, and it's the first exhibit, its item number 12 points out that the board's duty is to ensure that they prioritize the district's goals. Those are those goals formally adopted and developed by the board. So that really diminishes the likelihood of those individual personal agendas from disrupting the work of the board.
Working as one board is, this has been something I think we've mentioned almost every single foundational principle episode, is the importance of working as a group and speaking with one voice. Because if you let the one person on the board who's got their personal agenda start speaking up and overriding, it's just going to cause discourse. And it really causes this really domino effect throughout this whole process of board governance.
And it violates one of the terms of the oath of office, because an individual board member has no authority. So it's the board collective that must speak with one voice in order to do a greater work, a greater good within that district.
Absolutely. Well, I hope our listeners understand that this work of employing a superintendent is not an easy task, but it's one that every board has to do at some point and takes a lot of time, but the results are exponential and very worth putting in the effort to making sure you've got the right person for the right job. Again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the podcast, and thank you for your dedicated volunteer service to public education. If you would like to stay up to date with future episodes, please consider following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your platform of choice. Have a comment or question? We welcome listener feedback and invite you to send us an email at communications@iasb.com. Thank you.